Hi, this is Al. I'm back again. We're going to take a look at the instructor's presentation for week 7. In the interest of continuity and keeping connected between our weeks, I want to go back to week 6 for a minute and just recap. In week 6, we covered 3 more techniques of working with risks: the root cause identification analysis, risk register tables, and project templates. I hope you got some insight in there, and if there's any questions or nagging thoughts, please get in touch with me so I can clear it up for you. These are some very good techniques. We will be using risk register tables and also some project templates, and I'll show you some in the slides for weeks 9 and 10. And actually, we'll look at some more of those as we go forward. In conclusion, for risk 6, we took a look at those 3 techniques, and now in 7, we're going to take a look at assumptions analysis, decisions analysis, which also would include expected monetary analysis if the conditions are right, and estimating relationships. And those will be in Pritchard, chapters 19, 20, and 21. And assumptions is very interesting. Basically, what you're doing is you're going back throughout the whole project with a review team, and you're looking at all of the assumptions that were made, all of the considerations that related to assumptions. In the decision analysis chapter 20, expected monetary value, you're actually going to take a look at your decisions and analyze those based on whether or not they were made under certainty or made under uncertainty. In other words, certainty is when everything is known about the nature, the states of the nature are known. Something that you have to sort of make a decision because you got to make a decision, but you don't have all the information for the decision. And then when we go into estimating relationships, we're looking at establishing what the risk reserve or risk analysis might be based on estimating relationships, but that's not quite the same thing as when we're going through looking at cost estimating relationships, when we go through looking at our tasks and analyzing and estimating what the cost will be to do the test. So it's a little bit different from that point of view. What I mentioned last week is when we got into this week, what I wanted to do is actually walk through a risk process with you and take a risk walkthrough through the various steps, and we're going to do that. And we start out by looking at from a 10,000 foot level. Let's look at the major elements. What we're going to do, we're going to identify a risk from analyzing the project and the environment and all that, identify risk sources. The next thing you want to do is do your response development. What are you going to do about the risks that you now identified? And you have to define the risk, really understand it, and then take a look at what the impact might be, assign a probability of occurrence. Is this likely, really likely, highly likely? Can we fix a percentage to it? How do we set that up? And then look at a strategy, apply a strategy, a risk strategy. And there are 4 of those, and we'll go into that. And then for those risks that we're going to live with, so to speak, in a way that we're not going to be able to totally avoid them through one of the strategies, then we want to mitigate the impact. In other words, we want to make sure that we do something that will reduce the impact if the risk occurs. And that's called mitigation. And that's what we do there. And then for our actual management, our risk management, we implement that risk strategy for the risk, and then we monitor the project for new risks, but also for any changes in the risks we've already evaluated and that we have on our monitoring list, and those that we've set up some mitigation for. Because sometimes the impact changes. The impact or the probability can change. It could go from 50-50 to maybe 75% chance of the probability. Also, often in a project, the risk goes away. Its time is done. The risk will not occur now in the future. Because if it was going to occur, if we were going to have that risk occur and create an impact to the project, it would have already happened. Therefore, we can take that off our monitoring. We can reduce our observation of that. All right, let's take a look at how do we deal with risk. Now, let's say we've identified some risks, and there are things that might happen We've looked at the impacts. We get an idea about that. And so the first thing we want to do is how do we want to deal with the risk in a macro sense, in a large sense, in a strategic sense. And that, quite frankly, is the strategy. And one way we can do that is just accept the risks. In other words, from the strategy, the consequences are cheaper than the cure. In other words, just letting it happen is absorbing the impact is going to be less painful, less of an impact in cost and schedule than just letting it happen if it happens. In other words, we'll live with it. We're not going to do anything special about it. We'll monitor it, though. We'll take a look at it because it could change. The risk could change. The change could change to having a greater impact or a greater probability of occurring. And then we may want to change the strategy. So one of the strategies is just basically accepting it. The next one is avoid the risk. Like delete that part of the project. An example that I can share with you is that I had a multi-year project in California at a site. We had to do system testing of the system that we were installing or upgrading, actually, customizing or configuring so that it would meet the customer's requirements. We were not customizing it, we were configuring it. And we were installing the system. And then one of the system tests, or one of the tests for acceptance that we were going to perform, and the customer wanted us to perform, was to actually, after we have integrated it in their existing larger system, once our system is in there and working, they wanted to run what we would call an end-to-end test. In other words, how does our system and their system work together? How smooth does it work together? Are there any issues, any problems, anything of that nature? The customer wanted us to also be responsible for the response time, how long it took for these actions from when a system did something, or they changed a control or changed an input or something like that. They wanted us to be responsible for how fast the total system, including our system, responded and carried out the action. That was really not a part of our scope. And further, we had no knowledge of their system, of the overall larger system that we were integrating into. And in addition, we were not going to take responsibility for something we didn't know anything about or have anything to do with. And so we basically said, made a decision, and I talked to their project manager. I said, we will work with you on that test. We will be responsible for our system. We'd be interested in seeing what the overall delay or propagation time is, or how long it takes and all that. But we will not be responsible for the response time, including through your system. And that is not in the scope, and that is not our responsibility, and we're not going to become liable for that. The risk is too great, and our knowledge of it is insufficient, as well as we have no legal responsibility to take responsibility for the total overall larger system. So what we did was from our scope and our project plan, we deleted that part of the project. We deleted the testing or responsibility for the testing of the response time of the overall system, including our system. We were responsible for how fast our system responded, but not how fast the overall system would respond. The third strategy, monitor risk and prepare a contingency plan, is the one that we are probably most familiar with and most commonly do we work with. And that's basically what we are going to do is we're going to evaluate the risk. We're going to prepare some kind of mitigation. What can we do to mitigate that risk? What can we do to reduce the magnitude of the impact, either to cost or schedule or whatever, or performance? And then what we will do is we will continue to monitor that risk, be prepared for if it occurs, if the risk trigger occurs, which would create the impact of that risk to our project plan. We'll monitor it, and then we'll also prepare a contingency or mitigation. And the mitigation, whatever we might do, we might add some personnel to the project staff to do some monitoring or provide some service, which in a sense would mitigate and reduce the effective impact of that risk event. And should we, in implementing any mitigation or contingency, have a cost to that, in other words, if we were adding personnel, adding staff, then that cost does not go into the risk pool. That cost has to go into our budget right now because we will be spending that money. If our mitigation is costly or requires funding, then we have to do it. And a great example of that is your car insurance or your life insurance. Your car insurance, if you get in an accident, you buy insurance because you want to have your car repaired and any damage is covered and any monetary loss recovered. To do that, you buy insurance. So then periodically, every quarter, every half year, every year, you pay a premium to have that insurance. Well, that's your mitigation. That's your mitigation against the risk of having a collision which creates damage and which can cost you a significant amount of money. To mitigate that impact, should that event occur, you buy insurance. And that's your mitigation plan. And that mitigation costs money. And that money is represented by the premiums that you pay. So there's a specific example of where you would monitor a risk and have a contingency plan or mitigation. That's also a strategy called transferring the risk. In other words, instead of you carrying that financial risk in case you have an accident, your strategy is to transfer it. Have somebody else do it. Have somebody else responsible for it. And that's the case where you would buy insurance. Talking about your car insurance, we're really employing two strategies. One is transferring the risk and the other is monitoring and preparing a mitigation plan or contingency for it. But the overall huge liability in having a car accident is a strategy of transferring the risk to the insurance company and you buy insurance from them, but then you've got to pay for it. So these are the four major strategies that we use when we start to analyze and manage our risks. Once we know the risk, the impact, the probability it's going to occur, then we look at which strategy we're going to apply. Can we avoid the risk, like de-scope it, take it out of the contract like I talked about? Can we accept the risk? Oh, what the heck. Will the impact of this or the probability of its occurring is so low or the impact is so low that we will just accept the risk, and so we're just going to live with the consequences. And that's a management decision. And then we have the last two that we talked about, transferring the risk or monitoring the risk and having contingency package. So, okay, let's do a walkthrough on risk. Okay, the first thing we want to do when we're working with risks is we want to assess it. What is the risk? We need to define what the risk is. An earthquake, the risk is our subcontractor will not deliver on time. Our risk is that the customer will disapprove our design review. What is the risk? What is the risk we're trying to evaluate here and mitigate, somehow reduce its impact to the project? It might be a key person in the project leaving. Once we've defined what the risk is, then we have to evaluate what is its impact. To do that, we really want a quantitative estimate. What is the cost impact? What is the impact to schedule or schedule impact? And is there a performance impact? If so, what is it? We want to evaluate these. In some cases, maybe the impact won't affect all three elements, cost, schedule, and performance. But we need to make sure we evaluate them all. And if it does, we got to identify that. And then after we've looked at the risk, identified the risk, evaluated the impact, quantified the impact, whatever impact it would have to cost, schedule, and performance of the project, then what is the probability of occurrence? In other words, 10%, 30% probability it'll occur, 90%, 70%? How do we establish probability of occurrence? And after we've established that and accepted that, then the question is we take a look at all this and we say, is it still a risk or not? If the probability is so low or the impact is so low, we might just say it's not really a risk, and we're just going to worry about it. So this is assessment. If it is, or if we come up and say it is a risk, if we realize that this is a risk, then we go to step 2, which is our strategy and mitigation. want to select a strategy on the basis of the capability of the project and the impact of the project. In other words, what's it going to do to the project? What's the best strategy to neutralize the impact of this risk or do away with the impact of this risk? If there's a strategy that requires some mitigation, added staff, special insurance, whatever, hire a subcontractor, then we have to estimate the costs of whatever that mitigation is. Once we've established or identified some form of mitigation or some other way to reduce the impact, we need to reassess the probability of the risk and the impact. In other words, if the impact of the risk was $100,000 before we did any mitigation or anything like that, what is the impact of the risk after we've done some mitigation? It might be down to, instead of 100,000, it might down to be 50,000, 70,000, 20,000. That has to be reassessed. So the probability, the change in the probability of the risk and the impact has to be reassessed. And now we also need to know that if we're going to do some form of mitigation, any cost of that mitigation must be included because it will be an incurred cost. We will spend that money. That's got to go into our budget. So it's got to go into our project plan. At this point, we can evaluate alternative strategies or other mitigations. Is there a better way to mitigate, to reduce this impact? Is there a better way to handle this? So we go through this process, and once we've come to a conclusion, then basically we're going to set that course of action. In other words, we're going to implement that mitigation, record the change, the reassessment of the probability and the impact of the risk with the mitigation, and then we will have completed this step regarding step 2, strategy and mitigation. Third, in our risk walkthrough, we want to evaluate and establish the risk threshold. What do we mean by that? Fundamentally, it goes as follows. We'll have a large number of risks that we've evaluated, taken mitigation on, or done something about, or decided we would just live with the consequences, or we have de-scoped them, whatever the strategy is that we applied. But we will find that we have a large number of risks remaining. Usually at this point we would we prioritize them according to either their probability of occurrence or how large the impact is if they were to occur. And we want to rank the risks in the ones that'll do the most damage to the project, all the way down to the ones that'll do the least damage to the project. At this point, we will say there are too many risks or more than enough risks that we can actually track and monitor throughout the project. So what we'll do is we'll make a cutoff. We might say, okay, let's say any risk that's got a 40% probability or less, we're going to watch it, but we're not going to actively monitor it and mitigate it like we are anything greater than a 40% probability. And so we would have our list of risks, and we draw a line on the page wherever that breakpoint is. And anything above the line are risks that we were going to actively monitor and continuously watch. And anything below that line, we're going to keep our eye on, but we're not really going to set up any mitigation or do anything special for it. Monthly, or however often we review our risks for the project and see what the status is and what's changed, we'll also take a look at those risks that are below the line, and we'll note if any of them have changed, either in impact or probability, whether or not we need to move them above the line and track them. And we'll also identify any new risks that have come to our attention and decide where they go in that prioritized list and whether they're going to be just tracked or whether we're actually going to do something active about them. We will continue to monitor them, whether they're impacting cost, schedule, or performance. But there is a classification here, for instance, like if the project does not have schedule as a project priority. For instance, cost is important. We got to stay within cost. But If the project, the 12-month project, actually takes 18 months or 15 months or 14 months, that's all right. The company or the customer or the sponsor can live with that. In that case, then any risk that is strictly a schedule impacted risk or impacts risk schedule could be ignored. But we need to make sure that there's no collateral impact to like cost or schedule or anything like that. Because if a schedule risk has a cost impact or a performance impact, then we can't drop it just because schedule is not a priority of the project. In other words, schedule is not sacred in the sense that we have to meet our dates. I really haven't found any projects that we didn't have a schedule we had to hit. Not once the project plan has been put in place. Quite often your customer or your sponsor is doing something in preparation for receiving the deliverables from your project. And so they're counting on you delivering your project on time, and they're planning on their work and their requirements to be ready when you make your deliverables so that there can be continuity and integration between what your project is delivering and what the customer has to do in preparation for the project deliverables. Okay, so those are the steps. Those are the steps we walk through. Assessment. First is assessment. Second is strategy and mitigation. Third is evaluate and establish a risk threshold. With that in mind, let's now run through a risk calculation, an example. Let's say that we got a project and it's delayed, and the risk is that it's going to be delayed for 2 weeks, and the probability is about 80%. It's pretty high. And what that delay says, if we're delayed for 2 weeks, our project staff with a half a month of delay is going to cost us about $160,000. So that 2-week delay, about a half a month, we're talking about 2 weeks being 2 calendar weeks, 2 business weeks, 10 working days, and as a rule of thumb, we just say there's four weeks in a month. So this is about a half a month. And so we're going to have a project delayed for 2 weeks, so that's going to, our cost for keeping our project staff for a half a month longer is $160,000. Now we look at the event probability and its impact. We say we take the probability of 80% times the $160,000 for a half a month delay, and we multiply that together, and so we say that the weighted impact is $128,000. It's 160,000 times 80%. So the weighted impact is 128,000. So this is the way we would list this risk. We have a project delay of 2 weeks with a probability of 80%, and the weighted impact would be about $128,000. Now, we'll take a look at mitigation on this risk, and we see that maybe we can create a workaround for half the project team. In other words, maybe we don't have the whole project team sitting still for half a month. We can create work. We can have work for half the project team. But to have this workaround, to create this workaround, to set it up, it's going to cost us $5,000. So that's our cost of mitigation. $5,000, the cost of the workaround, is the cost of mitigation. So now we go back and we say, okay, now what's our net impact look like? Well, first of all, we've created a workaround for half the project team. So we don't have the whole project staff sitting still for a half a month at $160,000. We only got half the project staff sitting still for a half a month. So that's $80,000. So now our net impact after mitigation is 80% times $80,000, one half of our project team for half a month, plus the $5,000, which is the cost of the workaround, because we're going to have to spend that $5,000. If we don't spend that $5,000, we don't create the workaround, and we're not going to be able to have half the project team keep working. So our net impact is 80% times 80,000 plus $5,000, or $69,000. So what we've actually done is we have reduced the impact of the risk from $128,000 to $69,000. And that's an improvement of $59,000. What does that mean? That means that by spending $5,000 for the cost of the workaround and keeping half the project team working, we have actually saved $59,000. And so therefore, our workaround is valuable. If our cost of our workaround was exceeded the cost of the savings, the 59,000, then it would be really wouldn't make any practical sense to actually do the workaround. But here we say by spending $5,000 we can save $59,000. So we have actually done an improvement. We have mitigated the risk and we have changed the impact. We've taken the risk from a weighted impact of 128,000 down to 69,000. The difference between the two is $59,000 improvement in what it would cost, and we have achieved that $59,000 improvement by spending $5,000. Okay? All right. That concludes talking about this risk calculation, and I hope that this has cleared up some questions you might have in your head. What we have done is we have done an actual risk analysis. We have looked at a strategy, determined a mitigation, applied mitigation, and then walked through the calculations of what the impact of the risk was originally, what its weighted impact was, and then we've applied mitigation, determine the cost of mitigation, determine what the net impact is after mitigation, and then we've evaluated the reduction in the risk in the impact, and then determined that that improvement was significantly greater than the cost of the mitigation, and therefore it is a valid, good mitigation for this particular risk. And so we have completed the work on this particular risk. And this is the process that we would apply on each risk, evaluating each risk, and not just on the dollars, but also on schedule. And in this particular case, we have not looked at that half month and decided, is there something we can do to reduce that half month? So we have evaluated the impact on cost, and we've gone through our computations looking at mitigating the cost risk impact, but we haven't done anything about the schedule impact. And I'm only walking you through that so that you can see clearly what we have done and what we have not done yet. All right? Okay. That concludes that part of it, and that concludes the presentation for this week. Talking briefly about taking a look at the following week, week 8. Our topics there, we're going to look at 3 more techniques, and that's network analysis, not including PERT, and then we're going to look at PERT, and we're going to look at some other diagramming techniques, and those will be interesting too. So thank you. Looking forward to a great week. Remember, I'm always open to your correspondence and calls and emails. And if there's anything I can do to be of any value, let me know, and we'll take it from there. You have a great day.